Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CLI-ALPMA Innovation and Legaltech Week 2021 on-demand program. My name is Michael Bacina. I'm a partner in the FinTech, Financial Services and Blockchain group at Piper Alderman. And this session today is focusing on blockchain. Is it the next legal service disruptor? I'm joined by Steve Vallas from Blockchain Australia. Steve, are you there?
Thank you, Michael. I think we always talk about blockchain, so it always feels like our calls and our conversations merge one into the other. I am the CEO of Blockchain Australia. I've been in this role for about 6 months, but in the ecosystem for the last 3 or 4 years. It's a fast-moving space. It's something that I would encourage all the lawyers who are going to be listening to become much more aware of, because we know that the conversations we had 18, 24 months ago have long since sort of pushed into the distant past, and now some of the initiatives and some of the opportunities I think that are presenting will in fact make this one of the key areas that will disrupt the legal profession and a lot of the client work that the legal profession is currently doing.
That's a very interesting viewpoint, Steve. I might be a little bit more skeptical about how fast the blockchain may disrupt legal services just yet. But just to give everyone who's tuning in an overview, and I should note that you're free to listen to this as a podcast or a video presentation. And there is 1 or 2 slides, which if you're coming in on podcast, there'll be a link to in the show notes. So for today's session, we will be going through a high-level overview of what a blockchain is as distinct from a digital currency, because there's a very important distinction there, and people regularly blur the two, which leads to other problems down the track. Then we're going to touch on just some of the high-level legal issues that are arising around digital currency, and then Steve's going to give some really interesting insights and an overview of the National Blockchain Roadmap and the working groups that are presently doing some fantastic work with the federal government. And then finally, subject to time, we'll talk about some of the regulatory examples and some high-profile use cases that Steve and I have been seeing in the industry, and perhaps make some crystal ball suggestions or some suggestions for further reading for those who want to get into this space a little deeper. So first of all, I'm going to ask Steve for his definition of what he describes a blockchain as to those who have no idea. Go.
It's a good first scaling question, Michael. Here's what I always say to people. Tell me what you do and I'll tell you what blockchain means for you and your industry. Because one of the real challenges in this space is the language has very quickly been co-opted, confused, used for a particular purpose and from a particular perspective. So for me, when I say blockchain, I use a very expansive sort of lens in that conversation, and it's not blocks, it's not necessarily anything to do with the purest view of what the space is. I'll let you touch on what that traditional sort of view is. For me, it's a lot of different technologies that merge together. One or other parts of it might be more succinctly described as blockchain in a technical from a technical perspective, but generally it is a mesh of technologies. That's the way I would generally characterise my definition of blockchain. But I'll let you do yours, and I'll come back to you about why I think the approach I'm taking is the bit that ultimately gets the uptake a little bit more broad-based.
Excellent. Well, I'm just going to share a slide, which, as I mentioned, will be in the show notes for podcast viewers, which is from a set of presentations that I use. I obviously, being a lawyer, go to a bit more of a technical definition than Steve's more encompassing approach. But this was originally, I think, from a Big Four consulting presentation that's been modified slightly. So I say, look, if you don't know what a blockchain is, it's a very, very secure kind of a database. Terribly boring. But to get into a little bit more detail on that, really, it's worth imagining that if you have a bunch of transactions on your computer, you have something that you might consider to be a ledger, and lawyers know what a trust account ledger is. It's one of those documents that lawyers do their best to avoid looking at as much as possible and leave it up to the accounts people. But if you imagine one of those, set a series of transactions, and you have a couple of accountants who are looking at this series of transactions on systems that they have separate to your computer. So you have some information that's stored in, say, just for our example purposes, 3 different places. It's distributed. And then when there's a transaction made, to use our trust account example, someone makes a payment out of the trust account, say to a client, the computer then emails the 2 accountants to let them know that's happened. Now they rush to make sure that all the authorizations are correct in our example for, say, the trust account payment to be made with approvals and whatnot. And the first to do their job properly and ensure that it's correct tells everybody else, and sets out the proof or evidence that the transaction is accurate, which in most cases will be here's proof there's money in the bank account and here's the authorizations to transfer the money, and of course that the account details were checked. And that's called a proof of work in these proof of work systems. And then subject to the other trust accountant in our example agreeing, everybody updates their ledger and carry on. Now with people involved, horrible, messy process, not much fun for anyone, unless you're one of those people who loves trust accounting, and if you enjoy that, more power to you. But for everybody else, it's not great. So that all happening in an automated way is, in essence, how a blockchain operates. And there's a bit of a visual slide that I often like to show, showing how it works in a bit more of a technical way around a transaction being broadcast around a network of computers. And again, what I just spoke to of systems checking, the accountants checking a transaction is what is described as the validation stage in this slide. And then moving on is where we start to drift into the digital currency or token area, where a record is then specifically identified as a thing. But ultimately, if a transaction is validated as correct, it gets added to a big list of other transactions attached to earlier lists of those transactions. And the final result is a very secure, described as censorship resistant series of transactions that people can independently validate. So when you're really looking at a blockchain at that conceptual level, as I mentioned before, it's a very, very secure database. And for the most part, these early blockchains are quite expensive to process data on. So they're not great from that perspective. They are distributed, so they're highly resilient to attack, because a copy being deleted somewhere or someone attempting to modify one copy of the database somewhere will automatically be rejected by the system. That's, in my early example, those accountants who are validating everything, or as you saw in that other slide, the computer nodes which are constantly checking that all the transactions are correct. So very, very secure, very, very hard to tamper with system that's fairly expensive. So that's the core technology that sits underneath it. And when people hear about that, they often say, well, what's the point of that? I have a perfectly fast, centralized database that can do amazing things. And that's great, but everybody's aware of the headlines and indeed issues around notifiable data breaches and cybersecurity problems of the hacking and release of data or misuse of technology within computer systems, be it companies or increasingly law firms are under these kinds of attacks. So there is a real benefit in many, many different deployments for a blockchain system that can give that protection to data and avoid outside interference. But as Steve mentioned, it's really what do you want to do with it and how will it look at the end? So the earliest deployment of a blockchain was the Bitcoin blockchain. And that's why people have a very close association with digital currency and cryptocurrencies alongside blockchain. Some people call it the killer app. I'm not sure if there is a killer app for blockchain, but maybe Steve, you might be able to speak to how the Bitcoin has arisen in the last 10 years, when we've all seen in early 2021 a rapid run up of its value. Steve, if you could speak to how that came about and perhaps where you've seen those two ideas diverge from being kept together as they have been.
Diverge is a very generous description. I think, Michael, never the twain should meet in a lot of these conversations. I'll go back just one step. What you described then absolutely is what I consider a blockchain. From my perspective as the non-lawyer, and I can happily say I was one for a short period of time, so I know where you all live. I understand that. Stepping back from that, I sort of asked the question then, I know what the end state that Michael described is. How did you get there? What are the permissions that are required to accumulate this information? How is that information stored? Is it an IoT device? Are there cybersecurity issues? That broadening is not blockchain per se, but it is a systems integration approach. So when I talk to people about blockchain projects, I talk about all the things that go ultimately into it. And that's back to that, what's your context? Because business processes exist. And I think one of the key mistakes has been, with respect to this technology, people have tried to sell a full stack, inverted commas, solution. And I don't think that's necessarily, given the maturity of the space, what you should be selling. What you should be selling potentially is a process improvement, an iteration or something else. That's much more saleable. On the Bitcoin side, Michael, I think it's been interesting watching it. I wasn't so early that I jumped in and grabbed it for basically no sense. I didn't invest what I probably should have. I watched with interest. In recent years, obviously, the interest has been peaked. Most obviously, I think in 2017-ish or 2018, a lot of interest around cryptocurrencies and an enormous run-up in the value of some of them and enormous losses for some people with respect to these things. It was a gateway into a speculative world. And part of this technology's appeal is that it allows almost a direct-to-consumer model to be available to people who want to invest. There's not the friction that is normally associated with a lot of other currencies, a lot of other investments. So I think it garnered a lot of attention. But Bitcoin is the origin story effectively here. Those that don't know, and it's worth reading about. It's an interesting story outside of your interest in the space. Many will know Satoshi Nakamoto, the person who created it. No one knows who it is or what group of people this is. It's a nice mystery. It adds to the story. Bitcoin serves a particular function at the moment. It's most often considered a store of value. People aren't really using it in a sense that it's being used as a day-to-day digital currency. Some people think it's thin air, and other people think it's the future of currency for the world. So lots of different views, and the truth is the jury is still out in a lot of these elements. But the jury was out 2 years ago and 4 years ago when this had no obvious value or no exchangeable value. And as of last month, I think it peaked at something in the order of about $50,000 for each Bitcoin. So what it is and what it was and what it's likely to be are still things that are being developed. But the implications of this technology have been enormous. And I think important to know, sticking on the cryptocurrency side, and Michael, I think you can speak to this well, is the ICO boom and what it spawned in 2017 and 18 in alternative currencies like Ether and the Ethereum sort of network. That led to effectively a land grab, a rush of funds. It's left scars because I think what it did do at the time was it drew in a lot of interest. And with a lot of interest, it also, I've always said, most of the projects were just ill-informed, under-resourced, and probably overly ambitious. There are some, of course, that went in there and deliberately sought to get funds from people as quickly as they possibly could with no real aim to do anything with those funds. But I think the most were misguided is probably the characterisation. I don't know whether you disagree about that, Michael, but if you could speak then to the implications in the regulatory sense, what the implications were for the way the ecosystem developed in 2017 and 2018.
Well, that's a very interesting viewpoint, Steve, and I think that's a really good example because while, as I mentioned before, a lot of people have cryptocurrencies and digital currencies as synonymous with a blockchain, which they're not, the press and lawsuits that have come out of the initial coin offering boom, as you mentioned before, Steve, just for those who aren't across that was a time in sort of 2016, 2017, a little bit in 2018, where projects were able to raise literally millions of dollars in tens of minutes, in some cases even less, by offering up a cryptographic token available online that people could usually exchange Bitcoin or ETH to buy. And all these random markets popped up where these things could be traded, and some of them shot up massively in value, shot down in value, as is always the case in a hot market. Scams proliferated, and it turns out in a decentralized world, which is designed to remove trust from the equation, other areas of trust weakness emerged, like entire projects being scams. So while you could trust the system to operate as it was designed, if someone was using these systems to issue something that was completely untrustworthy, well, that was the point that it failed. So the shifting around, removing of friction, as you said, Steve, to perhaps create some friction elsewhere that people had to be aware of, led to quite a few tears, but also, interestingly, brought a huge amount of attention and a huge amount of money into the space, not necessarily just in this ICO boom of small startups or whatnot, but got the attention and got a lot of funding from investors putting money into projects which had nothing to do with issuing magic internet money in a fundraising sense. And there's a number of Securities and Exchange Commission cases that are reported in the United States, particularly around settlements that they've entered into with token issuers from the ICO days. Australia's yet to see any major litigation surrounding token issuances back in those days. Quite a number of projects went offshore due to the uncertain regulatory nature, and ASIC issued several information sheets. Info 225, if you're interested in looking up, is their current guidance, and it's had a number of prior iterations. And it, of course, goes through to say that we don't regulate technology in Australia, but we regulate the activities that you do with technology in the same way that there is nothing illegal about owning a screwdriver, but there is definitely things that are illegal about using a screwdriver to jimmy open a car door. So it's worth thinking about that kind of concept in the same way, because you do run into these myths of, oh, blockchain's just for money launderers and scammers and things like that, because a bunch of ransomware scammers and projects purporting to be out of Nigeria or asking people to send money and untold riches would follow became involved and proliferated and sought to scam people out of money. I always, in any kind of talk that's dealing with basic levels of blockchain and digital currency, always want to flag that the amount of illicit activity on a blockchain is much more traceable and identifiable than a traditional system. I had the pleasure once of interviewing on panel the global head of financial crime for a very major international bank, who said, we have, number one, we have no idea of the amount of digital crime going on in total, perhaps in blockchain systems. But number two, that his view was there was certainly no more than was occurring as a proportion in the so-called real world. And number three, that this technology was the worst possible system for anyone wanting to undertake illegal activities, because it is entirely traceable. And unfortunately, there was a well-known newspaper journalist in the room who then, of course, ran a headline of "No one knows how much crime there is happening on the blockchain," which is unfortunately a trope that's been in the media quite frequently. But there is a couple of large companies that trace transactions on a blockchain. As I mentioned in that example earlier, where you have a ledger that records a transaction into a giant series of transactions that is stored in multiple locations, on a public blockchain, everyone can see every transaction. This is not an anonymous system. It's referred to as a pseudo-anonymous system. And that's because you might have an address that's represented as a number of numbers and letters. Imagine that your email address was not your name, but was a random bunch of characters you mashed into a keyboard. That's a good way of thinking about it. So once you know that somebody's email address is this particular string of characters mashed into the keyboard, in a blockchain system, you could effectively see all of the mail that they sent and received. So it's a really terrible system for people looking to do illegal things. Last year, there was the largest child exploitation and pornography website in the world taken down with 4 terabytes of illegal material in simultaneous raids globally. That was only made possible because the people who were customers of that site had gone to digital currency exchanges, given their identification over under existing AML CTF laws in order to open an account, bought Bitcoin under their name, and then used that Bitcoin to pay for illegal services, thus giving, in particular, the Department of Justice in the United States I won't say a breadcrumb trail because the birds can't eat it, a permanent bright line that can never go away trail from their names all the way to the illegal activity. And that enabled them to go and arrest 1,200 people around the world. And to my knowledge, none of them have pled anything but guilty. And I imagine why, because it's pretty damning evidence when you can see the name of someone being used to pay for a illegal product and shut down the entire site. Because also as part of that, of course, they identified where the Bitcoin had gone and ultimately identified those behind the wallets and shut down a huge amount of illegal activity. And that is one of the best examples of how people using this system would be caught. Whereas in, say, the old style of an illegal online product, burner credit cards and other things, or stolen credit cards, will be used via more anonymous systems, which would be next to impossible because of the amount of work required. But these public digital currency systems make it vastly easier to track transactions. The ATO now is being able to look into whether people who purchase digital currency in Australia and have registered and done it through digital currency exchanges are reporting their gains or losses appropriately, and all these other kind of deployments, which fundamentally come down to, imagine if regulators could monitor the money supply more closely, and if appropriate, look into transactions very closely to see whether or not compliance has been met or a crime has been committed. And we'll come a bit later as to why this is a useful thing for turning it around and saying that in industries where compliance is important, how it can be, the technology can be used to proactively ensure compliance has been shown. And I think the lawyers play a really important part of that process design as we move into a world where blockchain systems are going to start to eat more and more existing systems. And it might initially come in more at the in-house counsel level when IT or the C-suite is looking to shift and frankly automate and make things more efficient and save costs, through to disputes that will be coming about that will involve contracts which are partially automated, these so-called smart contracts. So I think that the legal issues in facing digital currency that we've seen to date really involve financial services laws and some criminal laws, and we're starting to see more disputes come out. But outside of that pure financial licensing and regulatory space, and also scams being attacked and the rise of an entire industry of digital currency exchanges, the legal issues around contracts that are starting to become automated or being able to be signed digitally or partially fulfilled in a decentralized or autonomous way, which is very important because it's a bit different from a contract you enter into with a streaming platform like Netflix or something, where you enter your credit card and you're digitally accepting terms of service and you're making a payment that is digital because it's very centralized. We're talking about more decentralized systems which can operate in a way that doesn't rely necessarily on a centralized system in the background, so that if that centralized system fails, the decentralized system still operates. So an interesting example that I was going to save for later, but I'll bring out now, is a Sydney company which is called MyStake that I followed for quite a few years. They thought that a blockchain would do wonders for company shares and cap tables and shareholding management. And they started very early on, well before their time, and built out what is in effect an interface to the ASIC database. And most lawyers are familiar with the ASIC database, having filled in forms and having to lodge them. And what this great little company has done is allow people to go in and not only record what their shareholding is and set up a company, but the company itself takes the ASIC agent appointment so they can push through the changes in the background. And what's interesting about that is, in the unlikely event, let's hope it never happens, that ASIC's database goes down or fails, this company is running a slightly decentralized system, which is resilient. So you may not even notice if ASIC's system were to go down, and touch wood, it's never gone down to date. But what's fascinating about that, because many people would say, well, what's the point, is that once you have that technology running, you can start to look at automating other things, like the issue of new shares, like the passing of resolutions, which to date have been done through fairly expensive online share registries, because there's no reason why, in the case of MyStake, they started doing it for little startups and small companies, but there's no reason why that technology cannot be deployed at a broader sense to make the management of larger companies or public companies. And you see that the ASX has a project underway that's had a number of delays because they have a very complicated series of deployments that are needed and great many stakeholders who need to be consulted, which is bringing a decentralized, or partially distributed, I should say, network to how trading and settlement will work. And it's going to take much longer than it was originally hoped to deploy, but that's a real world example moving forward that's going to require a whole lot of contracts to be rewritten, and will no doubt lead to interesting issues and possible disputes along the way. But once working firmly, should enable a faster process for all of the ASX listed companies in Australia to manage how they do business and also deal with issuances that they want to do. And that kind of efficiency is very significant, given if any of you are holders of shares or run a self-managed super fund, dealing with the amount of paper that can come out, or even digital paper that comes out, which requires you to still interact with it in a paper-based way. So I think that a fair summary is, the more paper-based systems are at the moment, the more ripe they are to be replaced or made more efficient or automated via a blockchain system. Would that be a fair summary, Steve?
I think it is, and it sort of connects the dots on a few things, I think, Michael. When I said at the start that the legal profession will be disrupted, there'll be the need for lots of lawyers. I'm talking about the actual process of legal firms. I mean, the way you run your business is where this disruption is often coming. I sort of connect the dots for a few people, where we bridge the currency, the cryptocurrency side, and then the divide that is business as usual and other aspects. Sort of following on from your point about the value of illicit behaviour, this narrative that has been baked into a conversation around the cryptocurrency space for years. There's a business called Chainalysis. It's a $1 billion business now. Its business is tracking and tracing transactions, and their latest estimates are, for our region, something in the order of 1.3% is the illicit transaction value. So we're saying that 98.3% isn't. So that sort of narrative is passing. So whether or not you believe it to be this sort of space, by transaction volume, a very, very small percentage. You look at what they're actually tracking, and I think this is where the divide is is conquered. This is the transfer of value. And in the case of Bitcoin or some other token, you're transferring dollar value. Ultimately, when the people who are investing in it view it as an alternate to cash potential and investment, this is a transfer of value. Now, the system that Bitcoin is built on can transfer, as an example, $1 billion worth of value that people are ascribing in dollar terms. And it could charge, the system costs you $10, $20, $50 to move $1 billion. Now, that's the disruptive element here. Whether or not you believe Bitcoin itself has an inherent value, the technology that underpins it can move $1 billion worth of value for 50. What does that mean for businesses? And what does it mean for what you're moving? If data is valuable and you can move it at such low cost, what does it mean for business processes? And that's when people have that moment, they realise, I might not think this currency is a thing and I might not care, but that costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to move $1 billion in cash from one bank account to another. But this value can be moved basically for nothing. So what does that mean? What does it mean to all the businesses that bake in? So then when you look at it and you look at traditional customers of law firms and every other sort of business, what does it mean for banks? What does it mean for the people that facilitate transactions, for mortgage brokers? What does it mean for real estate agents? If you can deliver value and shift value, because ultimately we're moving ones and zeros, what does it mean to your business going forward? So that's the bit, once people get their head around, I think they find there maybe is much more application. And I said before, when you're talking about cryptocurrencies, you tend to have people that think it's a thing or not still, it's early. But most of the use cases, and we'll touch on that now, most of the use cases that are in consideration from a federal government level, and the federal government has been active now in driving interest in this space, they don't relate to cryptocurrencies. What they do relate to are business processes. And the National Blockchain Roadmap, which was delivered by the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources in February of last year, nominated 4 categories which are day-to-day business for most people. They relate to supply chains, they relate to credentials and ultimately the education sector and your ability to identify yourself. They relate to reg tech and they relate to cybersecurity. They're the use cases. So we have the federal government saying, put to one side what you might think is the nefarious dark web and financial services. This technology has application in these spaces. And ultimately, they serve the same purpose. They're saying, how do we transfer value? How do we monitor the transfer of value? How do we create auditability in the transfer of value? Suddenly you think, well, of course that applies to me as a supply chain person. And of course it applies to me as someone who seeks to put my education credentials on the blockchain, or the people that seek to detect intrusion on networks. Suddenly it's everywhere. And this has been part of the challenge of the space, Michael, that I think you and I found is it is everywhere potentially. And it is in some corners now in a material way. It's very difficult to then explain it in terms of people understand, because you can see it everywhere if you look for it everywhere. And in the legal profession, I spoke at an event a little while back when I was asked about, does this affect me in a property sense? And you can probably speak to that, Michael, that says, if someone says, could it potentially impact a property transaction? Well, I'll leave it to you to say, where could it potentially impact the transaction? Again, those dots. So the obvious, tell me, Michael, where could it possibly impact a property transaction?
Well, I'll use a different example, because it just touch on government and large corporates that are moving in the blockchain space. Aside from the ability to move value around, it's that auditability. I've mentioned at the top of our talk, the censorship resistance of a system. A huge amount of current systems and a huge amount of current disputes arise from parties doubting what another party has said, or parties taking different positions. So I spent many years as a junior lawyer, as a full-time litigator, so I'm well versed in putting evidence together on cases. And fundamentally, that's what most disputes come down to. There is a subset of disputes as well that just deal with the interpretation of law, but a huge number of the disputes that are in our courts by volume are about proof. Is there proof of what party A says such that party B should be held to be ordered to pay money or do something specific? Huge amount of disputes are sitting there. That area, as we start to see more blockchain systems come in, is likely to be disrupted significantly, because what keeps most disputes out of court presently is the cost of legal services. And specifically, as litigators who are watching would know, trial is very expensive. Second most expensive part is probably putting together the evidence. So a system which reduces the risk of dispute over what is the truth or what are the set of facts that we are discussing is going to move the dial on a number of industries that currently have to deal with that as a matter of course. So a party denying that some goods were delivered, for example, under a shared system where their systems were involved in recording and maintaining a copy of the delivery dockets, is going to have far less scope to dispute that something arrived. Will that mean that their dispute moves to, oh, quality of goods? Oh, but hang on a minute. If we suddenly have the quality checking also recorded on a blockchain, you're talking about reducing the process cost of clients in the dispute sense coming to a lawyer and saying, here's folders of material proving that shipping containers arrived on this date and the manifest is here and here's what happened and here's how it went through, and simply saying that's all properly electronic in a form that a court is going to recognize quickly. And I think the hope is that that kind of common set of facts, which is largely indisputable, subject to the garbage in, garbage out principle, means that parties are going to be less likely to want to go to court over that because the cost of proving the evidence will suddenly drop. But it could also mean an increase in certain kinds of disputes as parties move to arguing about the meaning of the principles of law which apply to those facts rather than having to prove the facts. The old saying, if your facts are not great, argue the law. If the law's not on your side, argue the facts, is very true, right? But we're going to have an issue rising where it will be less and less open to parties to argue the facts. They will be much more accepted once you have blockchain systems, which means you're moving to a preventative stage, or a lot more importance is placed upon the pre-dispute. Another area ripe for disruption is around, say, security of payments actions in the construction space. There's a whole lot of rules around the proof of service and making sure that payment claims and payment schedules were done on time. There's various systems that try and automate those. But again, a shared blockchain system where a party cannot dispute service if they are maintaining a copy of the system which records that information or a notice arriving, can't try and dodge service. They can likewise program in automatic responses. So there's a whole ability to meet contractual compliance in a fully automated way, just taking away a potential point of dispute, or in the optimistic litigator's view, shifting it to another point of arguing about interpretation or trying to challenge an unfair contract term. But at some level, those things are more useful to society to move along published decisions around what a particular phrase means at law, rather than matters clogging up a system which ultimately will settle once one party shows that they have necessary records. Because of course, you could have the best case in the world, but if you don't have the evidence and material to back it up, and I once dealt with a matter for a large maintenance company, which was owed a significant sum, and the other side said quite openly, well, we don't think you have the evidence to prove your case, without realizing my client was borderline obsessive about details and had a warehouse full of paperwork. And sure, it took several months for them to have some minions go through and pull out the paperwork, but of course they did and could make out their claim in minute detail, leading to a very rapid settlement. But in a blockchain system, you won't have that ability for one party to say, we're going to throw down the gauntlet and see if you actually have the evidence to make your case out, because it'll be a lot easier to put that material forward. So it's preparing for a world where that large piece of work is going to change remarkably. And it may take 10 or 20 years. So those watching who say, I'm going to be retired in 5 years, okay, you might be off the hook. And that's fine. There's no problem with that. Many people said, oh, the internet's here. I'm going to retire soon. It doesn't matter. I'm off the hook. I can not have to worry about it. But for everybody else, it's really important. And just bearing in mind the time that we have, Steve, maybe you can, I suppose, speak to some of the working groups sitting under the National Blockchain Roadmap. I'm grateful to be making a small contribution to the RegTech group, which might be of more interest to some of our viewers sitting in the legal space. But what excites you most about those working groups, and perhaps the RegTech group in particular?
I think the RegTech group is the biggest group, Michael. The truth of, I think the language is language that is in favour with politicians and with government departments, because they recognise how much of their business is making sure things are running as they should, and that real-time auditability exists, and the process improvement exists. It's the meat and potatoes when it comes to this space. I'll come back to it. The other ones, as I mentioned, supply chain is in there, as is credentialing. The interesting use cases and the things you sort of touched on then, that process that says authorship, ownership, accountability in supply chain, there's some ridiculous statistic like 30% of the cost of global shipping is the paperwork associated with global shipping. So the opportunities live there when you start realising how much of people's time and energy is spent determining ownership and then ultimately arguing about it or otherwise, they're the opportunities that I think will impact the legal profession. When it comes to credentials and some of the elements of credentials, you think of something like a working with children's check, or you're thinking about some organisation that has verified someone's identity. Those things ultimately, or currently, are siloed more often than not. But this technology allows for consideration at least, and ultimately I think a path towards a decentralised ownership of these things and access that is user-generated access levels. Not it's an open system. It says you are permissioned into this system, but it creates enormous efficiencies. On the cyber side, as I mentioned, that ultimately is something that says, threat analysis, intrusion determination, IoT information, and who it went through and what it passed through, those sorts of things. I'll come back to the RegTech. The RegTech for me is misconstrued, misunderstood by most people. There is tech with a capital T, and there's RegTech with a capital R. And we know that in the rooms that you and I are in, Michael, everyone laments the fact that people aren't getting, government's not getting the reg right, and we need clarity in these rules and don't give enough consideration to the fact that there is room to move. Be careful what you wish for is what I say to people who say, we need the government to make these rules. I said, once they've made them in the way that you want, you might not like where they land. On the tech side, I think the reality is processes for organisations, regulators, for ASIC and APRA, for the ACCC, if you have real-time auditability in these sorts of data sets, suddenly that role is improved. Protections are improved. So I think as the case for blockchain continues to grow, I think it's going to be a natural one, good news for lawyers, a natural one that will grow at a much faster pace than some of the others, because there's a ready acknowledgement that these sorts of insights into information and the risk associated with it and the protection that can be afforded retail investors, for argument's sake, are better served by the use of this technology. And I guess the push for those who are watching and listening is not a lot of people know how this works. Not a lot of people invest the time. Michael, you've been in the space for a long time. You are at the top of that mountain, I can happily say to you. And the truth is, you've climbed it. Most people haven't taken the time to give consideration to this subject matter. So I would encourage people to do that. But they're the 4 use cases. The government is rolling out working groups. I'm part of the steering committee. Those working groups are being tasked with reporting back to government over the next few months about each one of those use cases. So we are taking a very measured step towards these segments of the blockchain and distributed ledger technology ecosystem. And we're doing it with a view to building confidence. My role at Blockchain Australia is to do that, is to give confidence to the lawyers, to give confidence to the politicians and to the bureaucrats. This technology is not some scary, unable to determine consequences type stack. This is something that you can deploy over a long period of time, and it'll give you greater confidence and assurance in what's happening. So those reports will go back in March and April, and then the government will reflect on them and see whether or not it's something they want to prioritise at a global level for Australia to lead a conversation.
I'd agree with you there, Steve. I'd probably just add that, particularly for those who want to take your advice and get stuck in and learn more, the simple reality is Australia being the size that it is and the resourcing we have for regulators and legislative reform means that there are other countries who are leading the way in both the size of their blockchain markets and some of the adoption of technology. So looking at those projects that are currently happening overseas is a bit of a preview as to what will ultimately happen in Australia. A space that I'm very interested in at the moment is the central bank digital currency space, because it's my view that as soon as we start to see fully functional wholesale blockchain use by central banks, we're then going to start to see experiments at the retail usage, and that will probably be a catalyst for an incredible amount of disruption. So our title was Is Blockchain the Next Legal Service Disruptor? It may be the next after legal service disruptor, right? We have a lot of no-code technology out there at the moment, and other law tech, which I think in fairness is enabling firms to go and think about their processes and figure out how to rebuild their businesses from scratch, or just simply take advantage of low-code solutions to bring better service to their clients and streamline things. It's at the end of the day, it's about automation and efficiency and maintaining professional standards in the delivery of work to clients. It's not about trying to disintermediate law firms and take work away from law firms. It's more, I always use the example of Excel, right? Once upon a time, it took stupid amounts of money to have a spreadsheet made when they were made by hand back in the 60s and 70s. Silly money. Today, we could pull up on the side of while we're doing a podcast and put together a bit of an Excel spreadsheet and a formula or two in what 50 years ago would have been $1,000 exercise for an accountant to do. Yet there are more accountants per capita today than there were back then. Why? Because the cost of doing some of those things was so high. So I think there will be an overall ability for more to be delivered without more effort by lawyers. And it's not, the initial part is not necessarily going to be we're all jumping to blockchain, right? There is a few offerings. A Netherlands company called Legal Things has a great little suite of legal practice management software, which is quite rudimentary next to existing practice management systems, but they've recognized it's going to take a few years to build that out and to do things like accept digital ID, try and manage things in a way that is a lot more traceable. But it also means that auditing their files or files that are built on their systems should be a lot simpler because everything is recorded in a way that no one can change. Some lawyers might balk at that, who are a bit more old school and saying, all right, well, obviously if a client wants a file, I get to take out my file notes and prep it all and make sure everything's there, which is perfectly fine. There's not every problem needs a blockchain solution, but there's going to be some where there'll be big benefits. But like I say, once we have central bank digital currencies really coming into the fore, I think we'll see a huge acceleration in that space. And Australia is taking a careful approach and is generally a fast follower internationally when we see something good. And that's where we sit. So there's great opportunity to see what's happening elsewhere, to get a bit of an idea of what's coming in the future, separate to worrying about what might be disrupting your legal practice in the near future. So embracing what's happening around that kind of modular thinking and procedure thinking around those systems. There's nothing at all wrong with law firms embracing that and looking at the existing law tech. I often say to people who ask, well, what's the point then of blockchain if we're going to be looking at these other things? To which I answer, well, the idea is when you're looking at processes and systems, once you understand how blockchain works, you should be thinking about structuring those with a blockchain future in mind, because that way, when it comes, and make no mistake, it is coming, you will have an easier shift, both conceptually and in reality, of changing systems around. And that is true both for the sole practitioner or someone building a small, nimble law firm, right up to larger firms that are looking to deploy their own internal systems or roll out and take on other law tech.
And I said, Michael, here's the big 60-second finish. Now we're going to wrap up here. The bit that has been the mistake, I think, in the Australian jurisdiction is we've been really busy with things in the last 12 months. We haven't looked at what's happening overseas. And I can tell you that right now in the EU, they're creating what's known as the market of crypto assets. They're reframing the regulatory landscape for this. In China, China is building out a digital currency, and they are creating what they call the blockchain services network. They're connecting the pipes of information. In Singapore, in the Asia-Pacific region, they're aggressively moving into this space and creating frameworks so that digital currency exchanges can be regulated. In the US, right now, FinCEN, the OCC, and a bunch of others, the FSB, all the acronyms are involved here, Michael. Those businesses that are impacted by financial services and regulators are moving globally. And that's happening all day, every day. And people here have been largely oblivious to it, even when they should know. And I understand why that is, because the rate of change is enormous. But just that snapshot says the world is moving. So it'd be a shame if we missed out. So I would encourage everyone to participate.
So just when we thought the internet changed everything, it's all going to change again. But this is not a bad thing, because this is a very good thing. So I suppose in wrapping, it's our biggest advice to lawyers who are looking for the next disruptor, and assuming you tuned in because you wanted to see if this was it, is there are a number of disruptors coming, and we think this is probably the biggest one that's going to be moving slowly. But just like an iceberg, there's a whole lot more under the surface once you start to explore. And so getting in there and learning more about it, I think, is going to do every lawyer who engages in that an excellent service in future-proofing where they're heading. I think that we're probably pretty tight on time now, so I'll thank very much the College of Law for having us, and ALPMA for having us in as well. And Steve, thank you for your excellent comments. And if you've enjoyed this session and would like to receive updates about the work of CLI or ALPMA, please be sure to put in those letters in the LinkedIns and the Facebook and Twitters, and make sure you follow them. Steve, did you have any words of closing or advice for our viewers?
I do not. I'm rushing off to Hong Kong. So thank you for the time, Michael. I really enjoyed chatting to you again.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for everyone who's been watching.